I guess to start telling my story, I'll have to go back to my childhood. I think I was about 5 or 6 when my parents hustled up and brought a caravan to the south coast, near Weymouth. From then on, every school vacation we went there for all the holidays. Of course, my father couldn't go with us to the caravan every time because he had his own work commitments. So most of the year it was just my mom, my two sisters, and me in the caravan. After a couple of years, my dad bought a bigger caravan and we started inviting friends and relatives to vacation out of town. There were several other families there from all over the country who also had caravans on the site. So when my mom would take us to her place and we didn't have a dad with a car to go somewhere, my sisters and I would run around the lot in the neighborhood. We were lucky to have a family car in the 50s. Not many families had cars back then, and unfortunately, my mom never got behind the wheel. Although she managed to scare the hell out of a couple of driving instructors before she gave up on the idea, there were always other kids on the playground for me to play with. My sisters always thought they were above playing with little boys. My best friend, while there, was Harry. Harry was a year older than me, but for some reason the first time we met, we became instant friends. Harry had a huge red birthmark all over the left side of his face, and for some reason that I never could figure out when I was the same age, she was avoided by most of the other kids because of it. The birthmark, on the other hand, never bothered me, and Harry, being a real tomboy, turned into a good friend while I was there. In fact, unless Harry's family came to Weymouth for school vacations, I found the place very boring. Harry was an only child, and we seemed more like brother and sister than just friends. My two older sisters were a pair of arrogant little cows when they were young. As life progressed and we grew older, rock climbing and throwing rocks in the sea began to lose interest for Harry and me. Over the years, we explored just about every corner within a few miles. We found places to hide and peep at young couples kissing. It was fun for 10-year-olds to try to figure out what they were doing. But as we got older and wiser, it became awkward for us to peek at them together. We never talked about anything, but we were such close friends that we seemed to feel what each of us was going through inside. By then, Harry and I were considered old enough to take the bus to Weymouth on our own, where we explored the town and harbor. There were times when some ignorant people made remarks about Harry's face, and a couple of times I got into fights with other kids over it. I knew Harry got upset when they made remarks about her face. I guess when I was about 12 years old, Harry started wearing makeup to hide her birthmark. Honestly, I thought it looked worse than a bloody birthmark, but I never said anything. Harry and I started going to dances at a club located on the caravan site. We'd been there many times over the years. There was children's entertainment in the morning, then, as the day progressed, dances for the children, in the afternoon for the little ones, then for those older ones in the early evening, and then for the adults. But Harry and I were dancing now with the older kids. The bouncers were old friends of Harry and me. If anyone said anything about Harry's birthmark, the bouncers were usually there before I could react. I think they were watching me, realizing that I wouldn't tolerate anyone upsetting Harry. On Easter of my 15th year, Harry disappeared. My whole family arrived in Weymouth on the Thursday before Good Friday. I went straight to Harry's caravan but found that it was still closed for the winter. Investigation at the site office informed me that the caravan had been sold. The rest of the vacation was the worst of my life. My mom and dad picked me up every day. Later, my dad would tell me that he was trying to find out what had happened to Harry and her family. Years later, he told me that Harry's father died of the flu during the winter. Her mother couldn't keep the caravan going and sold it. My father hoped that he might be able to get Harry's address so I could at least write to her. But he never did. Harry and I had been friends at Weymouth, but it never occurred to us to find out each other's addresses and write. All I knew was that she lived somewhere near Bath. After Harry left, Weymouth lost interest to me. That summer I stayed at home with my father when my mother and sisters went to Weymouth. Dad and I went there during his summer vacation. I spent the rest of the summer with my high school friends. The next year, my mom decided it was time for us to join the latest boom, going abroad for summer vacation. I think my sisters, who by then were already dating boyfriends, started pressuring her about spending so much time away from her current lovers. The caravan was sold, and the clan went to bask in the sun for a couple weeks. A small clarification: not by airplane, but by train. The trip took 24 hours. I joined the family on their first trips to Rimini in Italy. But by the time I was 18, I wanted to get away with my buddies. So I stopped traveling with them. By then, pop festivals had become fashionable, and me and the guys would go there every chance we got. It was the 60s, and we had a great time for a few years. When I got out of college, I tried a lot of jobs, but I couldn't settle into any of them. By then, I was the proud owner of a 1959 Hillman Minx, my personal station wagon. One day, when my employer said something I didn't like, hell knows what it was, I told him to shove his job, which I couldn't stand anyway, up his ass, and walked away. I didn't get far before I stopped at a stoplight and felt a hard jolt. Someone had slammed into the back of the Hillman. I got out of the car and the truck driver appeared in front of me and was very apologetic. I don't remember how the conversation went, but it ended with me following him to his yard, which was nearby, where his boss promised to foot the bill for a new rear bumper and install it. The next day, I took the car to a transportation shop to have the new bumper installed and sat and waited in the waiting room while they did it. Weirder things happen in life. When some guy poked his head through the door and said, "Come with me," I followed him like a lamb. Why I didn't ask him why he wanted me to climb into the driver's seat of the truck, I never could figure out. I sat there like a dummy while he showed me all the controls and explained the gearbox. Then when he told me to drive straight out of the gate and turn left, I just started the engine and did what he told me. I drove the truck for about 30 minutes before we were back in the yard. When I parked the truck, he told me, "You can do it. If you asked me, I'd say you're a born craftsman." He then got out of the truck and started walking toward the office. I followed him, and as we were walking through the door, the boss I had met the day before came out of the inner office and said to him, "Mitch, I thought I asked you to take this guy to his driving test?" "Asked you to. He'll do just fine." "How did you do that if he's still sitting in my damn office?" "Well, I was unemployed, so I ended up getting the job and the other guy didn't." The following Monday, I hit the road as a truck driver. I have to say, I loved it. The first few months I had no idea what I was doing, but it turned out I had a great sense of direction. In those days, drivers took care of each other, and I have to thank many of them for teaching me how to properly load trucks and get them down to the cables and sheet metal. Working on the road seemed to suit my temperament. It was the first job I truly loved and mastered. I soon discovered that there were several companies that asked my boss to send me out when they hired a truck. I realized he liked it because it proved that I was doing a good job in keeping my customers happy. At Marshall's, one of the companies I picked up loads from on a regular basis, there was a girl named Thelma working in the dispatch room. Thelma was a doll in every sense of the word. She dressed up to tease the guys and enjoyed having them run around her. Short skirts and tight blouses showed off her gorgeous figure, and the high-heeled shoes showed off her legs to perfection. I realized Thelma was a tease when I first came to Marshall's. I'm certainly not weak with women, but I'm not the kind of damn fool who sticks out his tongue at the sight of beautiful legs. I let those knuckleheads chase Thelma while I negotiated business with her, and that was every time I called there since she was in charge of the control room. As time went on, I went to Marshall's more and more often, until I was working almost exclusively for him and a couple of our other drivers. I have to admit, I enjoyed working for them. It was like one big happy family. That's more than can be said for most companies. While I was waiting for a load, I had complete freedom of action and access to the dining room at my discretion. Old Man Marshall prided himself on knowing by name each of the 200-plus men in his workforce. Pretty soon he knew my name and the names of two other drivers from our firm who worked for him regularly. It was early December, and one Friday evening I pulled into our yard to fill up the diesel tank and get my paycheck. As I entered the office, Mr. Wilkins, my boss, came out of there and asked, "So, kid, what are your plans for tomorrow?" Nothing that he hadn't asked me before. It was usually a precursor to him asking me to work as a driver on Saturday. "Nothing in particular." "What do you have for today, boss?" I replied. "You got a decent suit, kid? We're going to Marshall's for Christmas. He invites us every year, and if we don't all come, the old bastard gets upset." "I don't mind, boss. I know how to comb my hair well when I need to, you know that." "Good. I'll meet you here at the shipyard at 6:30. George and Jack will go together, but there'll be plenty of room in the car for you. You can come with me and my wife." I was a little curious as to why George and Jack weren't going to ride with the boss and his wife, since his damn big Jaguar easily fit 5 people. But I didn't say anything. The next day, I felt as dressed up as a turkey. I hadn't had an excuse to wear any of my suits since I'd hit the road. I climbed into my boss's car to drive to Marshall's factory, where business negotiations were to be held in the huge dining room. Mr. Wilson had insisted that I call him Bill for the evening. but I knew I would be calling him boss again on Monday. He introduced me to his lovely wife, and I wondered how this old geezer had managed to get such a babe. I figured the answer probably lies in money, but let's forget about that as it has nothing to do with my story. As soon as we got to Marshall's, we were joined by George, Jack, and their wives, and I realized why they hadn't come with us. I wondered why they hadn't told me I could bring a guest with me. Not that I had anyone in particular in mind. But if they were inviting wives, they should have invited girlfriends as well. I figured it was an oversight on Bill Wilkins' part. Mr. and Mrs. Wilkins sat at the top table with Old Man Marshall, his wife, all the directors, and, I assumed, the bosses of the other firms that contracted with him. The five of us wandered around the tables looking for our assigned seats. With some confusion, we found a seat with the names of Jack, George, and their wives, but none of ours were nearby. I wandered around some more and began to suspect that I had been forgotten. Frankly, if I didn't find my place, I intended to slip out and hide until the meal was over. But suddenly Thelma patted me on the shoulder and led me to my seat, which was right next to hers. Come on, I'm not as stupid as I look. Thelma was sitting in the seat where my chaperone would have been sitting if I had been allowed to bring him along, which of course meant I was sitting where her chaperone should have been sitting, and I felt like I was being set up. Old Man Marshall was making his rounds while we waited for everyone to sort themselves out and take their seats. When he came up to me, thanking me for coming and for all the good work I had done on his behalf, he said, "Well, my boy, our dear Thelma has been left unaccompanied for this evening. I hope you won't mind looking after her in my place." I assured him that I would look after her, but I couldn't help wondering why sweet Thelma couldn't find a date. Dinner that night was prepared by outside vendors, as all of the dining hall staff had been invited. Some of them sat at our table, and I watched them scrutinize everything the vendors prepared and served. I doubt if a single dish had ever been subjected to such scrutiny. The meal was followed by endless speeches. The tables were moved to the side and an orchestra began to play. The music was strictly middle-aged, designed for the entire staff whose ages ranged from 16 to 60. Thelma and I danced alone, but several guys came up and asked her to dance too. By about 10:30, I had drunk perhaps a little more free booze than I should have. Dancing with Thelma to a slow number, I asked her why she had never been able to find a date for the evening. Thelma giggled. I think she'd had more drinks than she should have too. Don't be silly. I could have found plenty of guys who would have loved to come, but I wanted to spend this evening with you. Why? Do you really want to know? I wouldn't ask if I didn't want to. Well, because you intrigued me. Oh, I've intrigued you, haven't I? And why is that? Well, you know, you're different. I must have thrown Thelma a questioning look. Come on, you know what I mean. You don't chase me around like other guys do. I'm wondering why. Do you not find me attractive, or do you like men, or something else? Thelma, no, I'm certainly not a bloody poof. And I find you a very attractive young woman. Oh, so you have a steady girlfriend? No, as a matter of fact, I don't at the moment. Then why haven't you ever suggested that I go out with you? I've never said anything that would offend you, have I? Quite the opposite, Thelma. You're a lovely girl, as I said. But how old are you, 18 or 19? 19, Thelma replied. I'm 24, and I'm on the road 5 days a week and quite often away for several nights in a row. I'm looking for a permanent relationship. Please don't take this personally or as a criticism of you. I'm looking for a girl who I can go back to on Friday nights and who will be willing to put up with me doing almost nothing but going to the pub for a drink. A girl who won't go out with other guys when I'm away for a couple of nights. If you were looking for an unusual date with me, you got it tonight. But I don't think you want to settle down just yet. You like having guys chasing you around too much. Is that so? Yes, I'm afraid so. You're not disappointed, are you? Maybe a little disappointed. But can I at least give you some mistletoe today? Sure, girl, I'd love to. After that, I got the feeling that Thelma was trying to prove something. Anyway, every time we danced, we ended up under that damn mistletoe. Around 1 o'clock in the morning, George came in and said Mr. Wilkins was ready to leave. I kissed Thelma goodnight and she walked with me to the car. As the car was pulling out of the parking lot, I looked back and saw another guy walk up to her and put his arm around her shoulders. The next week I had another contract, so I didn't go to Marshall's. The week after that, they closed for the Christmas holidays. The boss talked me into doing a special job the day after Boxing Day. As a result, I was able to spend the New Year vacations in Aberdeen. At the time, they had just started looking for oil in the North Sea, and I was to take some research equipment there that was supposedly urgently needed. The weather was terrible, and I sat in port for nearly 2 weeks waiting for a blood ship to come in so I could unload the equipment. I had a great time in the pubs, though. There's no better place in the world to spend New Year's Eve than Scotland, even if it's blowing a gale, pouring rain, and bloody cold. By the time the ship I was waiting for finally showed up, the novelty had already started to wear off. Apparently, it was hiding from the storm in a harbor further up the coast. No one had realized to send me a message to meet them there. Yeah, well, I was just a lowly truck driver. Who cared about me? Back down south, I took a couple of days off so I wouldn't have to drive on New Year's Eve. I can't say my boss liked the idea, but he knew my reputation as someone who could tell my bosses what to do with their work if I was upset. And there was plenty of work for drivers in those days if you knew what you were doing. Wednesday morning, I parked first thing at the Marshall's loading dock. Upon entering the control room, I got the shock of my life. Sitting in Thelma's chair was a woman I hardly recognized, wearing a baggy sweater, slacks, and with her hair tied back in a ponytail. When she saw me, she jumped up from her chair and rushed toward me. Before I could say anything, her arms went around my neck and her tongue tried to find my tonsils. "Jesus, girl, are you trying to strangle me?" I asked when she finally came up for air. "I've missed you. Now tell me, will I pass the test now?" "Look, Thelma, I don't know what to say. Tell me, do I still look like a little slut who wants to run around with different guys every night?" "I never said you were like that." "Maybe you didn't, but you implied it. Now tell me, can I be considered your girlfriend now?" "Well, of course you can. You always have been, but..." "Good, then I'll be waiting for you to pick me up Friday night. Here's my address and here are your bills for the rest of the week." "Oh, I've got it all worked out, so you can finish early Friday. Now you better get on it because you've got a lot to do today and tomorrow." Okay, what the hell could I do or say that wouldn't upset the girl? So like a lamb to the slaughter, I kissed her and went back to the loading dock to load my truck. Friday night, I pulled up to her house to pick her up, around 7 o'clock. She came out of the house with an overnight bag. "What's that bag for, Thelma?" I asked nervously. "Well, I thought you wanted to go to the local pub. It must be 35 miles away at least. I thought I could stay at your place if you wanted. It would save you from having to drive back and forth picking me up and dropping me off all weekend." So Thelma stayed the weekend at my parents' house. No, not in my bed, but in my sister's bed. By then, they had both married and moved away. Thelma slept in their old room. The next weekend, I stayed at her parents' house, and we visited pubs around where she lived. Her parents were very nice. I got on well with her father and younger brother. I'm not sure her mother was interested at first, but eventually she got over it. Yes, you heard right. Thelma had me wrapped around her finger since that very first weekend. Since then, she had never worn anything provocative to work or any other time that I knew of, except when she was out with me. And then I was shocked if she wasn't dressed to the tune of $1 million. 3 months later, we got engaged, and before I knew it, we had already put a deposit down on an old shabby house almost halfway between our parents' two houses. Over the next year, we spent all of our free time practically rebuilding the house. At least we brought it up to 20th century standards. When the house was done, the next logical step was to get married. And so we did. The reception, of course, was held in Marshall's dining room, and the catering was handled by the dining room staff. Old man Marshall was there, came up and told me how happy he was to see us together. How much he was involved in Thelma's plan to capture me, I never realized. Perhaps Thelma was just using him. As I was to learn, she used a lot of people. Life over the next few years was sweet. Thelma got pregnant fairly soon after we were married. We used condoms most of the time, but we had just gotten married and things got a little hectic at times, you know how it is. We had one child, Tracy, and we decided to have a second one, Helen, as soon as possible. 2, we decided, would be enough, and Thelma found a permanent solution to the contraception problem. When she was carrying Helen, she started having problems, and the doctors were very concerned. She was admitted to the hospital early and monitored closely. When Thelma was still carrying Tracy, one day I got a call from Old Man Marshall. The gist of the call was that his transportation manager was retiring. Since Thelma was on maternity leave, he was, to put it bluntly, on shit street. He had already talked to Bill Wilkins and asked me if I would take over as transportation manager, at least until Thelma went back to work. This would be convenient for me, since I would be on site when Thelma went into labor and wouldn't be rushing across the country while Thelma breastfed the baby. So I agreed with some reluctance. The only problem was that when Thelma and I decided to have a second child, my position at Marshall's became permanent. The job wasn't difficult. It required knowledge of vehicles and the ability to plan the routes the trucks should take. After a while, I found that I really enjoyed it. Not as much as being on the road, but the money was better and I didn't have to work overtime. In a way, I was glad to be able to spend time with our two little angels. I was sure that when they grew up, they would become cannibals like their mother. I must admit that there were troubling times ahead of me, but I figured I would cross that bridge when I got to it. So life went on, as I suppose it does for most couples with young children. I genuinely thought I had everything worked out in my life. A good job, a beautiful home, a loving wife, and a wonderful pair of daughters. But things can go wrong exactly when you don't expect them to. If I wanted to pinpoint a time, I'd say the earliest indication that something wasn't as it should be was when Tracy had just turned 6. I was driving to work one morning and noticed a car behind me. Okay, you'll say, we have public roads, so you should expect a car to follow you occasionally. But notice I said the car behind me. Remember, I was a truck driver for several years. If you're driving a truck all day and you're good at your job, you're very attentive to what's going on around you. If you're hauling valuable cargo, there may be a few small movers in the truck behind you who want to save you the work of delivering it. Or it could be one of the other big headaches for a driver with a busy schedule, an unmarked police patrol car. If you know what you're doing, keep an eye out for cars traveling behind you. All drivers should do this anyway. I'm talking about the car and its passengers. Believe me, you can spot them a mile away if your head is on straight. No, the car I noticed behind me was standing still. As we pulled out into the intersection, if he stayed behind, he would overtake everyone until he was on my tail again. He definitely wasn't a cop. They drive a lot better than this Pratt guy, but it was obvious he was following me. In the evening, as I was leaving work, another car passed me. This time a different car with a woman driving, but she didn't leave my side all the way home. The next morning, the guy was there again, and in the evening, the woman followed me to the pub. Thursday night, I have a drink, just one since I'm driving, and play snooker with some of my staff. We hadn't been in the pub long when I noticed her walk into the pub, followed shortly by a guy. They walked to the bar separately and got their drinks. What happened next could be described as a farcical scenario. I'm playing snooker with one of the guys and this slut is sitting behind the bar, showing off all her anatomical features and looking at me so intently that I can feel her eyes drilling holes in my back. A couple times during my play, the woman's eyes met mine, and when they met, she smiled at me. The only thing I couldn't figure out was who was trying to set me up and why. But I didn't get the slightest chance to bite. I don't know what kind of idiot they thought I was, but I wasn't going to play the game they were up to. To the question of why, I thought I had an answer. Old man Marshall was very much a family man and placed great importance on family. Christ, he ran his company as if it was one big family. I, on the other hand, was an outsider who was invited into the firm after I married one of Marshall's favorite employees. I quickly became his favorite, and word spread around the firm that I held a prominent position at Marshall. I figured someone was jealous or thought I would eventually become his competition for a promotion. Whoever it was, I figured they were trying to sway me into something that would eventually ruin my marriage and possibly change old man Marshall's opinion of me. Finishing my drink, I bought another one to hide my true intentions. Then, after taking a sip, I headed to the gentleman's room, where I slipped out the back door unnoticed by everyone. I would have loved to get even with these two, but having no idea who was trying to set me up, I didn't know who I could trust, so I just drove home. I wondered how long they had been waiting for me to return from the gentleman's. The next morning, the guy was there again, but this time I passed him easily. In the evening, as I drove out of the marshal's yard, a woman immediately followed me. I took her on a little mystery tour that ended at a small factory estate that I knew well from driving trucks. It ended in a cul-de-sac. Parking the car, I crept between the buildings where the woman couldn't see me and crept until I was behind her car. Then she suddenly found me standing at the door of her car. She immediately realized that I was following her and, taking me by surprise, drove the car backwards at high speed. She made a skidding turn that would have put Rockford to shame, and in a few moments she was out of sight. Cursing myself for letting her get away, I got back in the car and drove home. To be honest, for a while, I thought that was the end of the episode. They never followed me again? I figured that since I had spotted them, they had given up. But 2 weeks later, when I arrived at the pub on a Thursday night, there was a different woman sitting behind the bar. As I was buying my drink from the bartender, she made some sort of remark. To be honest, I didn't connect her with the other two at first. It wasn't until she joined me at the jukebox where I was selecting a couple tunes that it got to me. Back off, lady, and tell your friends I'm not as dumb as I seem, I told her. And tell that Granada guy Pratt that if I ever see him again, I'm going to punch him in his goddamn head. The woman was taken by surprise. She looked completely shocked and left the pub almost immediately. When I arrived, I noticed a Ford Granada in the parking lot, but not its driver. I think it was about a month after that when Thelma stumbled one day in those damn high-heeled shoes she'd started wearing again and broke a bone in her ankle. While she was in the hospital, I got a call asking me to come get the girls. When I arrived, the doctor told me that the fracture, though not serious, needed to be fixed with a cast. But there was a problem. Thelma's ankle was swollen, and I had to wait for the swelling to go down before I could put the cast on. Thelma would have to stay in the hospital until the cast was put on, so I had to take a couple of days off to look after the girls, as it was during the school summer vacation. It was a nice change for me to play mom and dad. I know they took great pleasure in pulling a Mickey out of me when it came to cooking. I'm not a very good cook. I had a hard time guessing the timing. How the heck do you get all the different elements to finish cooking at the same time? Anyway, as I was juggling things in the kitchen that evening, the phone rang. Since I had my hands full, I asked Tracy to take the call. In my 6 years on the job, I thought she could handle it. We'd taught her what to do and say. "Oh, I'm sorry, Uncle Frank. Mom's in the hospital. She hurt her leg. Daddy's not here to watch us. Bye-bye." Tracy hung up the phone. "Who was that, Tracy?" I asked. "Oh, just Uncle Frank," she replied. As it seemed to me, there was only one problem with that answer. Who the hell is Uncle Frank? I had never heard of him before. I was just about to continue asking around when I heard Helen calling for her sister from the other room, and Tracy ran to see what she needed. Curious, I followed Tracy, but for some reason I didn't enter the playroom. "You're going to get in trouble from Mom. You broke your promise to Mom to never tell Dad about Uncle Frank." What the hell did I just hear from my daughter? I thought. And then I heard Tracy's response. A typical child's response. "I didn't tell Daddy about Uncle Frank." This was followed by the usual "you did," and "I didn't." I decided not to get into an argument. Both girls obviously realized that I wasn't supposed to know about this Uncle Frank story, and interfering in this conversation dispute would mean they were both on guard. I decided it was best to leave it at that and wait until they were calm about it again. But I was certainly concerned. I couldn't understand why Thelma would want to hide some guy from me. Unless what? Now that was a question I didn't want to ask myself. Denial was probably keeping me from thinking about it. The swelling on Thelma's ankle hadn't gone down overnight like the doctor had hoped. It seemed to me that it was much more swollen than the day before. When the nurse told me it could take as long as a week for the swelling to go down, I decided it was best to help at home before the girls got poisoned or started showing signs of malnutrition by refusing to eat my food. My sister volunteered to stay and help with the girls, which allowed me to find some time and do some office work. Sarah took her 9-year-old daughter Marcy with her. I can't say I liked Marcy very much. I think she took after her mother, who, although she was my sister, was never one of my favorite people when we were young. Now that we are older, our relationship is much better. I don't know exactly why I did it. Maybe I needed to confide in someone, but I told Sarah and Uncle Frank about it. My girls might have been sworn to secrecy from me, but Thelma might not have stipulated to other people. When I told Sarah, she sat and thought for a while. Then she asked, "What do you think, Thelma?" "I don't know what to think, Sarah, but I don't like it when my family keeps secrets from me." "Is that why you hated me and Ginny when we were little? We never told you about anything." "Maybe, but I certainly won't tolerate my wife keeping secrets from me, especially when it comes to men." "I don't blame you. Thelma is a beautiful woman. I could never understand how you captivated her." "The thing is, Sarah, I didn't captivate Thelma. She captivated me." "Well, she had good taste. You've got to hand it to her." "Anyway, what do you want? You want me to ask the girls about this, Frank?" "I thought they might open up to you. I heard Helen say, of course, that their mother made them promise not to talk about him. Now they may think they won't violate her trust if they tell you." "Leave it to me, and I'll try to find out something." "Thank you, sis, but try not to make a fuss and keep them on their guard." The next morning, I left Sarah with the kids and went to work. After lunch, I visited Thelma at the hospital, and she told me that Sarah had been with the girls for about an hour earlier in the day. I don't know what made me do it, but I asked Thelma if there was anything she wanted to tell me. I think I confused her. At least she didn't understand what I was asking her because all she came up with was a list of unpaid bills and chores that needed to be done around the house. That night, after Sarah put the kids to bed, she sat me down at the kitchen table and gave me a stern look. Well, I don't know who this Frank guy is, but I think you need to find out what the hell is going on. Then you asked the girls about him. What did they say? Don't be silly. I put Marcel in front of the problem. I figured the girls wouldn't recognize her as an adult and, oh, well, you know how kids think. So about this man, Frank. Apparently Thelma and him were talking to each other outside the school while Thelma waited for the girls to come out. From what the girls understand, he's divorced and his kids have to go to their school. They say this is the only chance they have to see them since he doesn't live with his wife. As far as I can tell, she had to get custody, and he claims she is preventing him from seeing them, so he has to watch them on school grounds. But why hide it from me? Marcy isn't stupid. She wondered the same thing. According to the girls, this Frank's wife supposedly works at your firm, and rumor has it you can tell her he's watching the kids at school. Oh, I see. Well, I suppose that explains it. But surely Thelma doesn't think I'd poison a guy in front of his wife. Nonsense. That silly story has no basis, in fact. Think to yourself. If this Frank guy was at the school when the kids were coming out of there, why wouldn't his so-called ex-wife see him there? And when I sent Marcy back with a few more questions, I got really worried. None of your girls have any idea who this guy Frank's kids are. Come on, it's a small school. It doesn't make any sense. On top of that, when Thelma takes the girls to the playground at the park after school, Frank is there too. What's more, he goes to the park during school vacations and has been to the mall with Thelma and the girls more than once. He buys ice cream, candy, and hamburgers for the kids. Little brother, you have a serious problem and you need to fix it as soon as possible. Thelma was probably planning to meet this Frank the other day when she had her fall. That's probably why he called here that day and asked why she never showed up. So you think they're having an affair? How the hell should I know what to think? But I will tell you that something very suspicious is going on, and we need to find out what it is. Good thing you said we, or I was starting to lose the thread of the conversation. You shouldn't lose the thread of the conversation. There may be an innocent explanation for this that we can't see yet. But frankly, I doubt it. Now think about it, brother. Can you think of anything Thelma has said or done in the last few months that might have made a difference? Anything unusual or different from the usual? Well, not that Thelma did anything, but a strange thing happened that week. I told Sarah about being followed and about two girls who I could only describe as trying to pick me up in the pub. Sarah couldn't understand what was going on either. The next day went pretty much the same as the previous day. Thelma's ankle started to show signs of the swelling going down, and the nurses told me that everything was going well and she should be home by the weekend. In the evening, when the kids went to bed, Sarah, who had been on edge since I'd been in the house, couldn't wait to be alone. "What color was the car that followed you?" she asked as soon as the kitchen door closed. "It was a maroon Ford Granada. Why?" "Almost. The girls called it dark red. I think it's the same car Frank drove after you. And I've got some bad news. Marcy says she thinks the girls have a crush on him. They gave her detailed descriptions of his insides. They told her how big it was, how soft the seats were, and the kids' locks were on, so they couldn't open the doors from the inside. Kids will only notice things like that if they've been inside the car." That's where I agree with you. Look, I did a favor today and called Bill Wilkins. He's got friends on the police force, and he's trying to get names and addresses from the license plates of the cars that followed me. Good idea, brother. I think you owe Marcy a big debt of gratitude for all she's done for the girls. Yeah, I know. I'm lucky she's as crafty as her mother. I don't know if I should take that as a compliment or not, Sarah replied with a smile on her face. Next chapter. Friday morning, Bill Wilkins called me into the office fairly early. He informed me that the Granada belonged to one Frank Williams, who was well known to the police. The other two cars were rented from a cheap car rental company. Strangely, one of them was not returned, and the renter, a man, used fake IDs to take both cars. After lunch, after making a few phone calls, I went to the hospital to pick up Thelma. I talked a little with the nurse I had been in contact with all week before Thelma found out about my arrival. After some small talk, she told me that every day after I left, a man came to see Thelma. Something seemed strange to her because he never brought anything with him for Thelma. Most people bring something with them, even if it's just a card wishing them health. No, I thought, our Frank Williams won't want to leave any evidence that might pique my curiosity. Frank Williams is nice enough when he's hunting, but if he thought he could get away with what I suspected, something else entirely awaited him. That evening when we got home, Thelma was surprised that the kids didn't meet us at the door. Entering the house on crutches, she asked where they were. I sent them to their folks for a few days, thought it would give you a chance to get cleaned up. Oh, that wasn't necessary, Thelma said, making herself comfortable on the living room couch. I'd rather they were here. But I think they were here, Thelma. We have a lot to sort out in the next couple days. I don't want the girls to get unnecessarily upset. What kind of things? Thelma asked as Sarah entered the room, carrying a tray with tea and coffee on it. Oh, Sarah, you're still here. You didn't have to stay. I'm sure I can take care of myself and the children. I can stand on my ankle. It's in a cast now. I'm not here for you, Thelma. I'm here for my brother. Sarah said it with real venom in her voice. Thelma's face suddenly lost all color and she looked at me. What does all this mean? Well, that's the question I was going to ask you, Thelma. What the hell is going on between you and that perverted asshole Frank Williams? Thelma shifted her gaze from me to Sarah and then back to me. I thought she looked confused for a moment. Then she obviously made up her mind. Well, I suppose you've learned everything by now, haven't you? I suppose you had to at some point. I'm sorry, but I've fallen in love with someone else. I didn't want to tell you, but I'm going to divorce you and then marry Frank. Just like that? I asked. Yeah, I've been trying to figure out how to tell you for weeks now. I didn't want to hurt you any more than I had to. Sarah was about to say something, but the sound of movement behind her stopped her. That's all I needed to hear. Now I can spring into action. I'll be in touch. A woman's voice came from the hallway. Then we heard the front door close. I smiled at Sarah and then turned to Thelma again. That sounds very thoughtful of you if it isn't a lie. You put Frankie up to trying to set me up, didn't you? What was the plan? I get seduced by one of his prostitute girlfriends and hey, presto, you divorce me? I guess you thought I'd have to pay you alimony then, didn't you? What a good wife I had. Well, tough luck, baby. I didn't fall into your little trap. I gotta hand it to you. It was a good idea. You wanted to leave me with my good job and live with an unemployed asshole. And you planned on me supporting you in your new life. I don't know what you're talking about. What's the setup? Well, if you don't know, you better ask your weirdo boyfriend. Here's how it's going to go down. You have the weekend to get all your shit out of my house. My lawyer is already preparing the divorce papers. He says they'll be ready by Monday and you can sign them. You can't do that. You're the one who has to leave the house. I'm going to need it for the kids. Oh no, you won't need it, dear. You and your weirdo boyfriend won't come within 100 yards of my children. I'll let you visit them as long as either the social worker or me is present. Oh yes, it will be the social worker who gets the warrant from the judge tonight. What are you talking about? They can't do that. Oh, but they can, honey. You know, I always thought social workers were a pain in the ass. But when they found out it was Frank Williams you were going to cohabit with and endanger our children, they became very sympathetic. They won't let you near them anymore, and I think the police will want to talk to you too. I don't understand. Why would the police want to talk to me? You stupid bitch, Sarah interjected. She was determined to speak up. So I let her continue. What do you think Williams was doing hanging around that damn school? The man is a goddamn pedophile with a track record a mile long. He wasn't after you, you stupid little cow. He wanted your daughters. Thelma's face was pleasant to look at. She shifted her gaze from one to the other of us again. You're lying. Frank wouldn't have done that. Oh no? Where do you think he's spent the last 7 years? He's been working overseas, in the Far East, I think. More like the bloody Isle of Wight. Parkhurst Prison is there. Calling it overseas is a stretch. Anyway, when the police are done talking to him and my kids, we'll find out if he did anything to them. But I'm warning you, if that bastard touches my kids, I'll probably kill you both. Sarah had to call an ambulance because Thelma suddenly passed out and we couldn't wake her up. She must have been taken from the hospital by her father or brother, because I certainly didn't. I never saw her again until the day we signed the divorce papers. Thelma realized there was no point in asking for child custody because social services still had an order that she had put the girls in danger. It turned out that Thelma had left the children in Williams's care on more than one occasion while she went to the hair salon and the like. But the professionals who interviewed my girls told me they were sure nothing had happened. In their opinion, Williams was still in what they called the courtship stage and wanted to avoid scaring them off by acting too quickly. Williams had committed no crime that the police could point to. They were sure he had stolen a hired car, but no sooner had he used it for its intended purpose than the bubble burst. When I asked out of curiosity why they thought Williams had stolen the car, the police inspector looked at me and said, "Well, perhaps, sir, you're lucky, even if you think you've been through a rough time." The last unfortunate woman Williams persuaded to get into bed with him so he could abuse her children was a widow. Her husband was killed in an unsolved traffic accident. The problem is, we can't prove what Williams was going to use the car for, but we can speculate. From now on, if he stays here, we'll be watching him very closely. "Not too closely, I hope," I replied. The officer looked around to make sure there was no one else within earshot. "Oh, I shouldn't worry too much about that, sir, provided no one is killed. You'd be surprised how long the officer's standing guard will remain at large. Of course, I never told you that, and make sure you have a damn good and reliable alibi. There are a lot of do-gooders who think Williams and people like him are just mentally ill and in need of sympathy. It seems to me that if he were hanged, drawn, and quartered, he'd get off easy. He's a cunning evil bastard. And sir, don't be too hard on your wife. Williams is an expert at manipulating people. If you saw him in the interrogation room, you wouldn't believe the butter melting in his mouth. She never stood a chance from the moment he laid eyes on her. You know, it wasn't until we let her read Williams's file that she truly believed what a pervert he was. Looking back, I consider myself lucky to be alive. Williams, of course, had life insurance, but knowing what that asshole planned to do to my family, I decided I wasn't going to turn the other cheek. But I could afford to wait for the dust to settle. For the next few years, everything was put on hold. Thelma wasn't allowed to visit the kids alone. This was frustrating for both the girls and their mother because she couldn't take them anywhere. From what the police told me, and from what Thelma herself heard, I don't think she had a chance when she confronted Williams. I know she would never have tolerated his abuse of our girls if she had known about it. I have to think that way to be sane. So, after a year or so, I asked social services to relax the terms of Thelma's visitation with the children, and they agreed. Since the children were never taken into care, I had the final say in the matter. Thelma told me several times that she wished we could be together again, but I told her that would never happen. From talking to neighbors, I knew that on some days when the kids were at school, Williams's car was parked outside the house. Nothing could convince me that Thelma and Frank Williams were having a Bible reading session. Well, I don't know. There's a lot in the Bible. I told Thelma she should find herself another mug, which she eventually did. He turned out to be a pretty nice guy, although a bit cocky. From what I understand, he asked Thelma to marry him, but she declined until she told him everything. As far as I could tell, he listened to her story and then, without saying a word to her, got up and left. 2 weeks later, Thelma hit Williams with a car outside a local store. She spotted Williams outside another school nearby. Thelma called the police, and they took him in for questioning. But Thelma waited outside the police station until he was released. She then drove her car into him as he was walking on the sidewalk. She then drove to the river and threw herself into it, presumably trying to drown herself. I have to say, I'm not at all sure that was the case. Thelma is a very good manipulator, and from what I heard, she was followed by a police car. At first, she was charged with manslaughter. The charges were later dropped. Thelma's mental state was deemed so unstable that she could not plead guilty. She was admitted to a local psychiatric hospital, but it was soon concluded that she was not a danger to the community, and she was discharged after a month or so. She was required to see a psychiatrist every 2 weeks, but no more often. And of course, social services tightened up to make sure she visited the children again. And that's how it was resolved. Sarah's husband Ralph started working on oil rigs, in the North Sea. So Sarah and her family actually moved in with me to help look after the girls and also to organize Thelma's visits to them. By then, however, more and more time had passed between each visit, and I hadn't spoken to her for what seemed like years. Next chapter. I think it was shortly before Helen's 10th birthday. One evening, Sarah, Ralph, and I were sitting in the kitchen talking about the old days when we were kids. Of course, the conversation turned to Sarah and I's summer vacations in Weymouth. Ralph had suggested that we all go there for 2 weeks that summer. Sarah jumped at the idea, and before Ralph and I realized what she was doing, she had invited Ginny and her family to come too. We rented 3 caravans next to each other on the same property where our family had vacationed as kids. The kids loved the beach and enjoyed talking about the places we played as kids. We found a few locals we knew as kids. One morning, I took my 2 girls for a walk along the cliffs. Things have changed a lot here due to the erosion of the mud slopes by the sea. It took me quite a while to find the tree on which Harry and I carved our initials each year. Some of them could still be made out quite clearly. H&H, 1959, Tracy said. I wonder who they were and where they are now. Well, one of them is standing right next to you, I replied. Are you kidding, Daddy? Tracy said. Then who was H? Oh, she was just a friend. What do you mean? Was she your childhood sweetheart, Daddy? Helen asked excitedly. I wasn't prepared for what I had gotten myself into. I guess she was, in a way. I spent many long, happy vacations with her when I was your age, but I'm not sure she could be called my sweetheart. I only kissed her once. Was it nice? I wasn't sure if Tracy was trying to embarrass me or if she was really interested. Yes, it was very pleasurable. I would have loved to kiss her more, but she didn't come back the next year. Oh, that's sad. Were you very upset? Yes, I was, but if you don't mind, we'll change the subject. The subject was changed, but for the rest of the vacation, everywhere we went, my 2 girls asked if I had been there with Harry. Sarah and Ginny would think fast and answer Tracy before I could shut up and say I couldn't remember. Marks were appearing on the cakes, and things that Sarah and Ginny were making that looked remarkably like H&H. I tried to show my displeasure, but they would start laughing, and I couldn't keep from laughing. When vacation was over and we came home, things got even worse for me. My mom and dad, at Tracy and Helen's insistence, dug up all the old pictures of Harry and I as kids on vacation and showed them to the girls. One thing I want to tell my girls. Although Harry's birthmark was very prominent in many of the pictures, I never heard any of my daughters mention or ask about it. I don't know if my sisters told them about it or not, but I never heard it mentioned. The next year we went to Weymouth again, but this time it was just me and my girls, Sarah and Marcy. Ralph was supposed to go with us, but he backed out at the last minute, saying he had things to do at work. I was surprised that Sarah took it so calmly, since he spends most of his time on the rigs. For the trip to Weymouth, we managed to cram everyone into my car, placing the luggage on the roof. For the first couple days, we settled in and had a great time. But Tuesday morning at breakfast, my girls suddenly announced that they wanted to go and find the tree with the carving on the trunk again. So around 10 o'clock, we hit the road. The 3 girls were full of energy that morning, singing and dancing for what seemed to me to be no reason at all. When we got to the tree, Tracy ran up to it and started yelling, "Yes, yes, he did it! He did it!" The 3 girls crowded around and started looking at the tree. As Sarah and I got closer, the girls moved away from the tree. Underneath the 1959 plaque was another one. It said H&H 1982. For a few moments I stared at it, not realizing what was going on. Then Ralph appeared from the nearby bushes, and with him several kids I didn't recognize. She said you know where to find her. She said to tell you that she was the one you spied courting couples from. She'd like to meet you alone. I don't think I stopped to say anything to Ralph. I headed at a jog toward our old hideout. But when I reached the place, Harry was no longer in sight. Confused and bewildered, I turned around and started walking back. I hadn't gotten far before Harry suddenly jumped out to meet me. The old game we used to play when we were kids. Jesus, Harry, you scared the shit out of me, was all I could think of to say. Well, it's a big deal when you make me jump. We chatted to each other like we were kids. When we got back to the tree, the others had already left. Slowly, telling Harry the story of our lives, well, the abridged version, we walked back to the caravan. Harry told me that when her father died, her mother was unable to maintain the caravan and sold it. According to her, she, like me, was upset that we never saw each other again. In time, her mother remarried to a very nice man who, when Harry was in her teens, paid a huge amount of money to have Harry's birthmark removed using a very early laser method. It hadn't been entirely successful, but it had really boosted her self-esteem. Then she said something that surprised me. She said that only one event had raised her self-esteem so much, and that was when she met me as a child. She said that I was the only child she had ever met who had never once admonished her about her birthmark or even asked about it. Then Harry told me that she married a soldier and bore him two wonderful children. But sadly, in 1978, he was killed during a training exercise. Since then, she had lived with her stepfather and her mother had died of a stroke a few years earlier. That's where Ralph found her. Don't ask me how he did it. Sarah told me later that he got almost all the guys from his oil rig who lived near Bath to ask questions. Eventually, someone remembered a girl with a boy's name and a birthmark on her face. Ralph went there and found her a few weeks before the holiday, but I was kept in the dark until that morning. Sarah said she really thought Helen and Tracy had let the cat out of the bag a couple of times. Harry and her two children stayed with us in the caravan for the rest of the vacation. No, Harry and I didn't jump into bed with each other. We had a special friendship as children and got to know each other in adulthood. There's something to that, but we'll have to wait and see what happens next. Will there be a romance between us? I'm not sure, but I hope so, and I think my kids hope so too. I'll just say the signs are good. In Weymouth, everyone, including Harry's children, tried to stay away from us so that Harry and I could spend as much time together as possible. At the end of the vacation, Ralph and Sarah took Tracy and Helen back to their home, and I took Harry and her two children to Bath. Life goes on. April 2006. After a long drive along the M4 for the next 6 months, Harry and her two children Russell and Claire moved in with the girls and me. Shortly after the move, we had an unpleasant episode when Helen and Tracy started calling Harry Mummy and decided that they would address their mother as Thelma. Harry and I tried to talk them out of it by not reacting when Tracy and Helen called her mom. It didn't work because the girls, with the connivance of Harry's children Russell and Claire, repeated everything Helen and Tracy said. When Harry answered them, she would also answer Helen or Tracy. It has to be said that it took some getting used to, and Thelma was, to say the least, not thrilled. I don't know what happened between Thelma and the girls, but in the end she accepted it the way the girls wanted it. Harry speculated that the girls threatened to cut themselves off from Thelma if she argued. Sometimes I was surprised by the girls' hostility toward Thelma, which seemed to grow stronger as they grew older. And one day Harry told me that my girls weren't stupid. As they got older, they realized what had almost happened to them and why the social workers and police officers were asking them all these questions that seemed so silly at the time. Of course, eventually, Harry and I got married. No, we didn't rush into it. We had a very modest affair in Bermuda. It was something quite different. We had local witnesses and we didn't tell anyone about our plans. It was amazing how long Harry wore the extra ring before anyone noticed. Thelma's mental health had deteriorated over the years. It wasn't helped by the string of losers she'd gotten involved with. When Tracy married her half-brother Russell, Thelma was sane enough to attend the wedding and play the role of proud mother. She looked better than she had in years and was accompanied by a very proud father. Unfortunately, her father passed away a few months later, and shortly thereafter Thelma was placed in a sectional facility that her brother had organized. She now spends a lot of time in and out of the private clinic, which I might add costs my brother and I a tidy sum. But I feel I have a duty of care to the mother of my children. Harry and I are very happy together. Now that all the children have grown up and moved away, we spend most of the year at our cottage near Weymouth. We enjoy walking the paths we used to walk on when we were children, sometimes with our grandchildren in our arms. Life goes on. The end. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed it. Subscribe to my channel and stay tuned for the next videos.